The Economics of Innocent Fraud. This is a really good book on economic myth. And what is economic myth? Economic myth is the set of ideas and concepts and core examples, maybe especially, that shape how people understand the economy to work and how people understand the system to work and what is legitimate and illegitimate within a system. And one of the ideas he brings to the forefront in this book is the fact that there is a divergence between how we understand the system to work and how it actually works. And he is a really serious economist. He was actually in the administration of 4 different presidents, both Republican and Democrat. During World War II, he was in charge of economic policy, including rationing, including price controls during World War II. This book was published in 2004, which was near the end of his life. So he had years of experience watching the economy and thinking carefully about how it worked. And let me give you a quote to set up sort of the premise of the book. I have learned that to be right and useful, one must accept a continuing divergence between approved belief, what I have elsewhere called conventional wisdom, and the reality. And in the end, unsurprisingly, it is the reality that counts. Out of the pecuniary and political pressures and fashions of the time, economics and larger economic and political systems cultivate their own versions of the truth. This last has no necessary relation to reality. No one is especially at fault. What is convenient to believe is greatly preferred. So yeah, he's saying the conventional wisdom about how the economic system works is diverging from reality. And this divergence is actually driven by financial and political interests that cultivate their own version of the truth. So I want to look into that. Where I'm going in this video, basically, first I want to lay out briefly what is an economic myth and some things about it. Then I'll just go through 6 economic myths that he covers in the book. And I will say the book is quite thin. A lot of his claims, they're just empirical. They're just saying this is what I have observed from my years working as an economist. But in his other books, which are thicker, he actually sort of fleshes out his ideas more. So I'll draw from other books as well. So let's return to economic myth. And I will say he does not use the term economic myth, but I think it'll be clear to you from the quotes I give from his book that that is what he's talking about. And returning to our definition, this is the set of concepts and core examples that shape how we think about the economy. And one of the things when we think about these core examples, it's these images that we have in our head that evoke certain properties of that image. And one example I might give is when we think of capital, we think of a physical machine that would be used in a factory. That's kind of the image from an Econ 101 textbook. And then we apply that image to other situations that are much more abstract and less concrete. But as we sort of move away to other parts of the economy, that image may be less and less applicable, and yet we still use that image to think about capital in other contexts. Now, he doesn't talk about capital in this book. I'm just giving you an example for thinking about core examples and how economic myth works. But one of the reasons I bring this up is because it's really easy to go about critiquing economic myth in a way that is not very discerning. So one thing about economic myth is that the myth itself, like the myth of capital as we think of it as a machine, that does apply in certain realms. And where the economic myth often goes wrong is not that it's never correct to think of this example and this analogy. It's that the example is extrapolated to places where it really doesn't apply well. So I think it's important to not throw out economic myth, but put them in their place and come up with better analogies that'll capture what's really going on. Because part of the endeavor on this channel is we're thinking through paradigm shifts in economics, governance, and knowledge systems. And in the economic realm, we're trying to get out from under the thumb of a system that has this power to the powerful dynamic. But on the other side of that, it's not like there's going to be no system. You still need to sustain a system. And it could be that some of the economic myths that are functioning in one role in the current system, they won't be thrown out, but they will be used in a very different way in a different system. So I think we just need to be very careful and discerning in how we critique economic myth. And he does an amazing job at this. I think he understands economics really well. Myth number 1 is going to be the myth of shareholder accountability. And this one is going to seem quite weird to people. So to set this up, we're going to have the characters in our story are the management of a firm, which is basically the C-suite and CEO. Now, this could actually be expanded. I'm not going to do that here. We're going to keep it simple. We're going to have the shareholders who own the firm, and then we'll have the researchers who are putting out information about that firm. The myth in Econ 101 classes here is that the firm's behavior and the management's decisions are held accountable to the shareholders' interests. And the shareholders, of course, are just saving money for retirement, so their desire is just for that firm to maximize profits. And he says, no, that's actually not where the power lies. The power does not lie with the shareholders. The power in this situation lies with the management of the firm. That the management essentially mostly does the appointing of the board of directors. The role of the board of directors, which is supposed to be to make sure the management of the firm is doing what's in the shareholders' best interest, that role is kind of ceremonial and kind of just there to keep up the myth that the firm is really just doing what the shareholders would want. No one should be in doubt. Shareholders, owners, and their alleged directors in any sizable enterprise are fully subordinate to the managers. Though the impression of owner authority is offered, it does not, in fact, exist. An accepted fraud. And if you're like, what the heck, let me try to explain, because the first thing to understand and to build into your economic thinking is that money is not a primary driver. Money is a secondary driver. People want money because of what it does for them. And people have different reasons for valuing money. Some people want security. For some people, they use that money to live out their goals, including their social goals, their generous goals. For some people, it's about status. There's so many different reasons that drive a person's desire for money. Now, in some circumstances, the money will act like a scoreboard and they're really playing a game that's oriented around that scoreboard. But still, the notion that money is a secondary motive sticks. And so we're building into our thinking, okay, what is behind the desire for money? The second piece of this is that he views corporations as bureaucracies. And what do bureaucracies like to do? Like, what is the impetus behind a bureaucracy? It's to make itself larger. Now, for a corporation, making itself larger actually does go along quite well with profit maximization, so that it's not that it's entirely at odds with the way people think about it, but the differences here, though subtle, might actually matter. And of course, why does a corporation want to get bigger? Part of that, if the C-suite is driving that, they will have higher status if they have more people underneath them. Part of it is social goals that the C-suite and the leadership in an organization, the way they live out their social goals is through their corporation. So that's another reason to want the size of it to expand. And let me give you some quotes here. As with all bureaucracies, that of the corporation has a powerful tendency to self-enlargement. Pay is determined in substantial measure by the number of one's subordinates. Life is more pleasant when thought and action are delegated to lesser ranks. All managements believe, as do economists, that money accruing to them serves a larger public good. Bureaucracy is a term that is scrupulously avoided. Management is the accepted reference. So avoiding the term bureaucracy is actually part of the way that this economic myth gets upheld. And another way is through all of this ceremony. And the ceremony is the shareholder meetings. It's the stuff that happens in Econ 101 classes with all the habit and ceremony that goes along with that. And let me read you some quotes on this. Capitalism, having given way to management come bureaucracy, an appearance of relevance for owners is contrived. Here the fraud. This fraud has accepted ceremonial aspects. One is a board of directors selected by management, fully subordinate to the management, but heard as the voice of shareholders. Regarding shareholder meetings, the resemblance is to a covenanted Baptist church service. Regarding the relationship between the board of directors and management of a firm, the relationship somewhat resembles that of an honorary degree recipient to a member of a university faculty. Now, you may still be skeptical because it seems like the shareholders are voting on the board of directors. Isn't that a real mechanism of accountability? And part of the story has to do with the way information works and the way the knowledge about the company moves to everybody, including the shareholders. And this really gets at our second myth, which is the myth that finance research depicts reality. And to think about this, we can come back to our three players: the management of the firm, the shareholders, and the finance researchers, who are oftentimes economists. And this one really focuses on what are the incentives for the finance researchers to put out accurate information versus information that's distorted in a certain way. And by finance researchers, we're talking about kind of independent finance journalists. We're talking about the people inside companies like BlackRock and Vanguard, who are in charge of investing people's money. They're in charge of making big decisions for many shareholders. And just other people around Wall Street who are putting out information about the investments. That's who we're talking about. And his case here is really that these people are operating under their own incentive structure, which is not exactly the way people think it is. And so let me start with a couple of quotes. On Wall Street, economists chose to forecast what most rewarded those requesting the research. Regarding research in finance, the men and women so engaged believe and are believed by others to have knowledge of the unknown. Research is thought to create such knowledge. Because what is predicted is what others wish to hear and what they wish to profit or have some return from, hope or need covers reality. Let's unpack the reasons behind this a little bit. And the first piece of this has to do with the self-fulfilling prophecy nature of finance information. That is, when a firm has information that's distorted in its favor, where the negative sides of the firm are minimized, that actually increases the chances that the firm will succeed in the long run. And of course, the finance industry is all about operating around the edges of these probability distributions. So distorted information can actually kind of nudge the success of the firm in one direction or another. And both the shareholders and the management of the firm want that firm to succeed, except for the shareholders also want accurate information despite that. So there's a little bit of a conflict and a little bit of an alignment in what they might want about the information of that firm. But that's just part of the story. The second part here has to do with the principal agent problem related to information flow, where the finance researchers, where do they get all of their information? It's from the firm itself. Most of the information about the firm is coming out of the firm. So of course the firm has an incentive to distort that information in certain ways. But there's also a bit of a weird incentive for the finance researchers because they need that information if they're going to continue in their jobs. If the firm stops giving them that information, they will lose status in that community. So they need to kind of be nice to the people giving them the information that their job depends upon. Third, we have the structure of finance information, the types of spreadsheets that come out of firms, the way they're organized. that comes from Finance 101 courses. And anytime you have a fixed structure of something, that can be gamed by people in the firm. And I should say gamed with air quotes, because there's a reason he's using the word innocent in the title of his book. He is making the argument that the people doing this do not realize the information distortion is going on. But if you can game a system based on knowing its structure, that gaming may happen despite anybody's intentions. Over a professional lifetime in economics, as a teacher, author, and sometime political official, and from some personal interest, I have read through dozens, perhaps hundreds of corporate financial statements. That some were a disguise for quiet larceny did not cross my mind. And finally, this is about information distortion. It is not about explicitly false information. Because ethical people on Wall Street want to be honest, and dishonesty is very likely to be caught. But distortion of information is way more subtle and easier to fall through the cracks. And of course, the way I explain this is it's about salience frames, where salience has to do with what kinds of information is weighing heavily and what kinds of information is falling to the wayside. I use the frame of a camera analogy. The salient information is what's front and center. Non-salient information is at the fuzzy edges of the screen and outside the screen. And of course, all these incentives I've been discussing come together to create an emphasis on information that's positive about the firm, a de-emphasis on information that's negative, and this force could be a profound perpetrator of some of the downstream side effects of things that come from decisions made on Wall Street. Let me give you a quote. "Here is the measure of human achievement: negative social effects. Pollution, destruction of the landscape, the unprotected health of the citizenry, the threat of military action and death do not count as such. When measuring achievement, the good and the disastrous can be combined." The next myth will be the myth of the state-corporate separation. And basically, he's arguing that the corporate sector and the government are enmeshed. They are entangled. In fact, another book that sort of looks at this is from an economist who is an institutional economist studying the entangled political economy. The fact that these two sectors have an entangled relationship, kind of like the word entanglement is used in physics in a certain way, and he's kind of making the argument it could be used in economics in the way these sectors are intertwined. And let me give you a Galbraith quote on this. "The accepted distinction between the public and the private sectors has no meaning when seriously viewed. Rhetoric, not reality. A large, vital, and expanding part of what is called the public sector is for all practical effect in the private sector." And there are a lot of different parts to this, including the revolving door. So in government, we have situations where the regulators have job opportunities to work later on down the road in their careers in the industries they're regulating. And knowing that, they know they don't want to piss off people in that industry too much by being too adversarial to the industry, because that cuts out possibilities for their upward mobility in their careers. And that's called the revolving door because it's this notion that people who work in industry go to work for government, people who work in government go to work in industry, and that's sort of a constantly revolving door that sustains this incestuous relationship. But there's also the notion of government contracting, the fact that a lot of private firms are actually contracting out with the government. So those firms aren't really private. The fact that the government has the power to make those contracts makes it a major actor in the private sector. And then there's the fact that legislation can and does create demand, generating large parts of the economy. So because of that, corporations invest a lot of money in lobbying in trying to generate the demand. And then finally, something he talks a lot about in this book is the social relationships between the government sector workers and the corporate sector workers, especially leadership of both of those types of bureaucracies. They have a back and forth mutual relationship where they come to take on each other's goals and values and support each other in a mutually fulfilling relationship that is great for the end group there, but that might have certain effects on the economy. There is no question but that corporate influence extends to the regulators. It is less easy to defend corporate behavior in the face of a negative public view. Needed is independent, honest, professionally competent regulation. Again, a difficult thing to achieve in a world of corporate dominance. At this writing, corporate managers are in close alliance with the president, the vice president, and the secretary of defense. Major corporate figures are also in senior positions elsewhere in the federal government. One came from the bankrupt and thieving Enron to preside over the army. The next myth is the myth of consumer sovereignty. And in Econ 101 courses, you're taught essentially that the consumer wants something and the producers are responding to that desire, responding to the want. So the sovereignty comes from the orientation of the economy being around the needs and desires of the community. And in his other book, he calls this the reverse sequence, where it's not consumer demanding and producer responding. It's the bureaucracy of the corporate world having its need to expand itself. And to get that, it manages the demands of the people. It manages the needs and desires that people feel. And it does this through advertising in part, but not just advertising, it's actually more of a control of the entire ecosystem of our culture that generates people's hopes and dreams and what they orient their life around. And that this happens without people realizing the power and influence of the needs of the corporations to expand driving that. In the conventional instruction of the past, the market had special identification with consumer sovereignty, with the controlling power of the consumer in deciding what would be produced, bought, and sold. And that's what he's saying is a myth. As the ballot gives authority to the citizen, so in economic life, the demand curve accords authority to the consumer. In both ballot and buyer, there is a formidable, well-financed management of the public response. And to some degree, it's not that there's no consumer sovereignty, but some of what feels like choice for the consumer is actually a little bit more like a parent saying, do you want your eggs scrambled or do you want your eggs fried? So the kid may feel like they have choice. Of course, I get to choose between these options. But the parent is deciding the kid gets eggs. And that kind of relationship between the corporate sector and the desires and the choices of the population is in some ways characteristic. Next is the myth of the small business role in the economy. And here basically we have an image that anyone can start a business, and they can do that from their vantage point in the economy, recognizing a need among people and sort of rising up and growing a business that meets that need, and that this has an element of accountability to the economy. The continued political and social celebration of small business and of family agriculture is a mildly innocent form of fraud. Tradition, romance, not the reality. And you can see there the role of the images we have in our head when we understand how the system works. Myth number 6 is the myth of the powerless oligopolists. The fact that sometimes in Econ 101 courses, you get a sense that the whole system is mutually holding each other accountable. And so, of course, there is the perception that any individual actor, any individual large corporation or whatnot, is held accountable by the whole system, rather than that entity has power in and of itself. And of course, he's saying that's not actually how things work. No individual firm, no individual capitalist is now thought to have power. That the market is subject to skilled and comprehensive management is unmentioned even in most economic teaching. Here, the fraud. He says the market is subject to skilled and comprehensive management. That's a pretty provocative claim. And I mean, he fleshes it out way more in this book, where he kind of says our system is moving toward being a centrally planned system, although it's different than the system of the USSR, when they had a centrally planned system, they have different structures and different mechanisms for the central planning aspect. And I will link below to my video I did a year ago on this book. Incredible book. But this author is just very provocative and very, I think, careful and astute in his thinking. And one thing I might do differently if I were to redo my video on this book is to not use the words communism and capitalism in the way I do in that video. I was trying to be provocative in the way I opened the video, but in some ways those terms are so loosey-goosey. They're used in so many different ways. And I think a better way of saying what I said in the video would be to say that both the US system, however you might describe it, and the USSR system, both of those depreciate in a power to the powerful way. And they depreciate at different rates, and there's different styles of depreciation, so different people may end up at the top of the power to the powerful dynamic structure. That's just a better, I think, more accurate way of describing what's going on in both systems. But hopefully you've found this book provocative in the economic myths it goes through, and I'm not finished with economic myths.